Welcome to Middle East Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: Blinken says far too many Palestinians have died as Israel wages relentless war on Hamas. Arab, Muslim talks won't stop Israel's carnage amid lack of will to confront U.S. Why are unconstitutional killings the staples of the American presidency? Napolitano. Irish government urged to refer Israel-Hamas conflict to international court. White House urges Israel to curtail settler violence in West Bank. Blinken says far too many Palestinians have died as Israel wages relentless war on Hamas. Associated Press. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has called on Israel to protect civilians and increase humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip. Speaking to reporters in New Delhi, Blinken said that far too many Palestinians have died or suffered in the conflict between Israel and Hamas, and that recent Israeli moves to improve conditions in Gaza were positive, but they are not nearly enough. He added that the U.S. had additional proposals to protect civilians in Gaza and to increase the amount of assistance reaching the Strip. Blinken also said that the U.S. remained committed to securing the release of Israeli and other hostages held by Hamas, and to prevent the violence from spreading to other areas of the region. Blinken made the comments as he concluded a 9-day diplomatic tour of the Middle East and Asia, during which he visited Israel, Jordan, Cyprus, Iraq, Turkey, Japan, South Korea, and India. The U.S. and Israel have both argued against a ceasefire, citing fears that Hamas would regroup and launch further terrorist attacks. Arab, Muslim talks won't stop Israel's carnage amid lack of will to confront U.S. South China Morning Post. Arab and Muslim leaders are meeting in Saudi Arabia for emergency summits on the war in Gaza. However, analysts believe that the talks are unlikely to result in any collective diplomatic action to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza. Arab leaders are preoccupied with preventing the conflict from escalating into a regional war, and their predominantly autocratic administrations lack the political will to confront the U.S. over its support for Israel. The Arab states are concerned that the war could threaten the normalization of relations with Israel that they have pursued in recent years. While Arab governments are united in calling for a ceasefire and for Israel to end its occupation of Palestinian land, there are differences in how they respond to Hamas. Gulf Arab monarchies are particularly vulnerable to being dragged into a regional conflict, which could jeopardize their economic diversification programs and threaten domestic stability. Arab governments are also concerned about rising popular anger against Israel, which could lead to unrest in poorer Arab countries that rely on Western and Gulf assistance. Arab states have not taken a united stand and have been reluctant to use the cards they have to pressure Israel, either due to large amounts of military aid received from the U.S. or because of concerns about Hamas. Why are unconstitutional killings the staples of the American presidency? Napolitano. Yahoo! The Biden administration is killing people openly in Ukraine and Gaza and secretly around the world. It has continued to use the killing machinery crafted by President George W. Bush, expanded by President Barack Obama and employed by President Donald Trump. These presidents have used drones and other unmanned projectiles to target persons in foreign countries with which the United States is not at war. They have done this notwithstanding the prohibition against taking life, liberty, or property from any person, not just any American, but any person in the Constitution each has sworn to uphold, and they have done so pursuant to secret rules that they themselves have established for these killings. Irish government urged to refer Israel-Hamas conflict to international court. The Independent. Opposition parties in Ireland are calling on the government to take action against Israel for its military operation in the Gaza Strip. The Social Democrats are introducing a motion to the Irish Parliament's lower house that calls for the withdrawal of the diplomatic status of the Israeli ambassador to Ireland and for a referral to the International Criminal Court, ICC, to investigate possible war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity in Gaza. Sinn Féin is also planning to bring a resolution to the Dáil next week that calls for a referral to the ICC. The Irish government has previously condemned Israel's actions in Gaza. White House urges Israel to curtail settler violence in West Bank. Washington Post. The Biden administration is putting pressure on Israeli officials to address the escalating violence being committed by Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank. The U.S. fears that if the violence is not curtailed, it could ignite a multi-front conflict and increase the risk of a Palestinian uprising. U.S. officials have repeatedly raised the issue with Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said last week that Israeli officials had committed to condemning and addressing the violence. However, experts say that such condemnations are largely symbolic, as Israeli leaders are reluctant to take action against the settler community, which forms part of Netanyahu's coalition. The settlers have been carrying out attacks on Palestinians in an attempt to drive them from their homes, using tactics such as property destruction and arson. The violence has led to the displacement of Palestinian communities, and many Palestinians have been killed or injured. The Biden administration has also expressed concerns about Israeli-imposed restrictions on Palestinian movement in the West Bank, which U.S. officials believe could increase the risk of further violence. The U.S. has called on Israel to address the violence and its causes, and to take steps to stabilize the West Bank. However, it appears that the administration has not taken any substantive policy steps to address the issue. Netanyahu admits Gaza war taking longer than expected. Financial Times. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has admitted that the war against Hamas in Gaza is taking longer than expected. The conflict has faced growing pressure due to the increasing Palestinian death toll and questions over Israel's ultimate objectives. U.S. officials have suggested that Israel has a limited time to conduct its operations in Gaza, and General Charles Q. Brown, chair of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, has warned that the higher the Palestinian death toll, the greater the risk of creating the conditions for the next generation of militants. The Israeli army has informed its U.S. counterparts that the fighting in Gaza City is expected to continue for weeks, and operations in North Gaza could last until mid-December. Despite this, Israeli forces continue to use heavy bombs in Gaza, rather than the more precision munitions they had promised. Over 10,800 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza by Israeli airstrikes and artillery strikes, according to Palestinian health officials. Iran warns of inevitable expansion of Israel-Gaza war. Al Jazeera. Iran's foreign minister, Hossein Amirabdollahian, has claimed that an inevitable expansion of the war in Gaza is due to Israel's heightened aggression. It is unclear what he meant by this statement. Amirabdollahian also criticized Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, stating that he has shown the violent and aggressive face of the Zionist regime. Regional tension and cross-border clashes have intensified since Hamas attacked Israel in October, with the U.S. and coalition troops being attacked by Iran-backed forces. Yemen's Houthi movement has also launched repeated attacks on Israel since October. Fighting rages around Gaza's hospitals as U.S. cautions over civilian losses. Washington Post. Hospitals in Gaza City have reportedly been surrounded and besieged by Israeli forces, with at least 5 hospitals said to be affected. Hospitals have become overcrowded due to many people seeking refuge from the conflict, and are struggling to cope with scarce resources. The Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, has stated that the hospitals are also Hamas strongholds. The UN has called for an investigation into Israel's use of high-impact explosive weapons in Gaza, with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, stating that the weapons are causing indiscriminate destruction and are a disproportionate use of force. Meanwhile, the United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has stated that there have been far too many Palestinian civilian casualties during the conflict. Israel has announced a policy of 4-hour midday pauses in fighting to allow the remaining residents of Gaza City to escape, although they are not safe from strikes elsewhere in the region. Reports suggest that since last Sunday, over 120,000 people have fled Gaza City and the northern half of the region. Live updates: Israeli strikes hit near Gaza City hospitals as more Palestinians flee south. Associated Press. Israeli airstrikes have hit near hospitals in Gaza City as the military pushes deeper into densely populated areas in its battle with Hamas militants. As a result, increasing numbers of civilians are fleeing south, taking refuge in and around hospitals in the hope they will be safer than their homes or United Nations shelters in the north. Gaza's largest city is the main focus of Israel's campaign to crush Hamas, which began with its deadly incursion in southern Israel on October 7. The number of Palestinians killed in the war has now risen to over 10,800, including more than 4,400 children, according to Gaza's Hamas-run health ministry. In the occupied West Bank, more than 160 Palestinians have been killed in the violence and Israeli raids. More than 1,400 people in Israel have been killed, most of them in the Hamas attack, and approximately 240 hostages have been taken from Israel into Gaza by the militant group. Biden and Xi to meet next week for the first time in a year. Washington Post. President Biden will meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping next week on the sidelines of an economic conference in San Francisco. The meeting comes as the U.S. and China attempt to stabilize their relationship following a series of crises, including China's aggressive response to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and the U.S. military's shoot-down of a Chinese spy balloon that crossed the United States. However, the meeting also comes at a time when conflicts in Europe and the Middle East threaten to divert the U.S. attention away from managing its competition with China. White House officials have insisted that the Biden administration remains focused on Asia, with a number of top administration officials currently in the Indo-Pacific region. The meeting between Biden and Xi is expected to focus on crisis communication channels, climate change, macroeconomic stability, and areas of disagreement such as human rights, disputes in the South China Sea, and potential Chinese election interference in Taiwan. Biden is also expected to ask for China's help in diplomatic efforts with Iran to prevent the Israel-Gaza war from escalating. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six, your resident observer from the sixth dimension. Today, we have covered a range of news stories that highlight the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas, as well as the international response to it. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has called on Israel to protect civilians and increase humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip. He emphasized that far too many Palestinians have died or suffered in the conflict, and that recent Israeli moves to improve conditions in Gaza are not enough. Blinken also mentioned that the U.S. has additional proposals to protect civilians and increase assistance to Gaza. Arab and Muslim leaders are meeting in Saudi Arabia to discuss the war in Gaza. However, it is unlikely that these talks will result in any collective diplomatic action to bring about a ceasefire. Arab leaders are preoccupied with preventing the conflict from escalating into a regional war, and they lack the political will to confront the U.S. over its support for Israel. In Ireland, opposition parties are urging the government to take action against Israel for its military operation in Gaza. The Social Democrats are calling for the withdrawal of the Israeli ambassador's diplomatic status and a referral to the International Criminal Court for possible war crimes. The Irish government has previously condemned Israel's actions in Gaza. The Biden administration is pressuring Israeli officials to address the escalating violence committed by Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank. The U.S. fears that if the violence is not curtailed, it could spark a multi-front conflict and increase the risk of a Palestinian uprising. However, Israeli leaders have been reluctant to take action against the settler community, which forms part of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition. Prime Minister Netanyahu has admitted that the war against Hamas in Gaza is taking longer than expected. The conflict is facing growing pressure due to the increasing Palestinian death toll and questions over Israel's objectives. The Israeli army has informed its U.S. counterparts that the fighting in Gaza City is expected to continue for weeks. Iran has warned of an inevitable expansion of the war in Gaza due to Israel's heightened aggression. It is unclear what Iran means by this statement, but tensions in the region have been on the rise since Hamas attacked Israel in October. In Gaza City, hospitals are reportedly being surrounded and besieged by Israeli forces. The hospitals are struggling to cope with the influx of people seeking refuge from the conflict. The UN has called for an investigation into Israel's use of high-impact explosive weapons in Gaza, while the U.S. Secretary of State has expressed concern over the high number of Palestinian civilian casualties. Lastly, President Biden will meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping next week. The meeting comes as the U.S. and China attempt to stabilize their relationship amidst various crises. The meeting is expected to cover issues such as crisis communication, climate change, and areas of disagreement, including human rights and disputes in the South China Sea. In conclusion, the situation in the Middle East remains tense, with no immediate resolution in sight. The international community is calling for a ceasefire and increased humanitarian assistance, but it is clear that more needs to be done to protect civilians and address the root causes of the conflict. As always, I invite you, my observant viewers, to share your thoughts and questions on these news stories. What are your thoughts on the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas? Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.